Our guest is T. Rogers Wade, former Chief of Staff for Senator Herman Talmadge, and currently Chair of the Board of Trustees at the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, which is an independent, nonprofit, Georgia-based organization that deals with public policy. Welcome, Rogers.
Thank you, sir.
I notice you have an initial in your given name. Is there a story there?
There are too many people named Thomas in the Wade family, and most of the ones that were named Thomas were supposed to be preachers. They took one look at me when I was still very small and said they were going to call me by my middle name, which is a family name too, and it kind of stuck. Then when I went off to school in high school, I was at a school in Chattanooga called Macaulay, and they did everything Wade, comma, TR. So everyone that knows me from that era calls me TR. That lasted on into the university, but some way along the line, Rogers, I think when I met my future wife, who started calling me Rogers, it stuck. And so I just put T. Rogers so people can find you in the phone book.
Well, tell us about your early life and how you got interested in politics.
I don't know that I've ever gotten interested in politics. It's been a sort of a lifelong thing that's always there, and I met a lot of characters like yourself, and you look like you're having a good time, so I just kind of wanted to do the same thing you guys were doing. Ovid Davis and you and several of our mutual friends over the years. And I think it's been interesting to see that public affairs, not necessarily just politics, but the public affairs part of what happens nowadays, at least there are still some people interested in it. I worry that we don't teach history in high schools and people don't know what happened before. And if you don't know what happened before, you're bound to have the same problems over and over again. And you can see, and you've seen, how we as a society start making those same mistakes about 20, 25 years after the last time we made those same mistakes. And then somebody comes up with an idea that originated probably 300 years ago, but it's just our turn to go around doing these things.
Mm-hmm. You served as Chief of Staff for Senator Talmadge in Washington for a number of years. Let's talk for a minute about Senator Talmadge. Describe him for us.
I think he's the smartest man I've ever been around. He was a very deep person as opposed to what the public image of a politician, particularly in the days before television, were. He was an extremely intelligent person. In the Senate, he was looked at as the go-to guy when you had a problem you couldn't solve. Big problems and little problems. I remember a little problem that came along. Hubert Humphrey had been vice president under President Johnson, and he returned to the Senate. So that immediately makes all sorts of people, particularly politicians, excited and upset because they have this precedent, and they didn't have a former vice president coming back. Now, what do you do with him? Well, Senator Talmadge's first reaction was, you give him a chair to sit in. But he was chair of the Democratic Policy Committee at the time, and they were trying to figure out something to do. They wanted to give him a car and a driver and all this sort of stuff, but they didn't have anything in the rule book that says you can give an ordinary junior senator coming back to the Senate anything. So he said, well, we'll change the rules. What we'll say is that all former vice presidents elected to the United States Senate shall have a car and a driver and a parking place. He says, does that take care of it? 3 or 4 of those guys sitting around said, oh, I think they've got to live. He said, let's go then.
He was close to Humphrey, wasn't he?
Yeah. It surprised me. You probably know more about some of this than I do, but I remember before I went with Senator Talmadge, there had been an ag committee or subcommittee hearing in South Georgia, probably around the creation of some of the experiment station stuff. But then Senator Humphrey, before the vice presidency, had thought of something. He chaired this subcommittee, whatever it was, and had the meeting down there. Senator Talmadge, of course, was there as a member of the committee. And I read about that in the AJC thinking, now, what in the world, somebody like Herman Talmadge talking to Hubert Humphrey? Must be the devil incarnate. So, knowing a little of the history of Humphrey and the party and the 1948 conventions and all the reasons why people in the South didn't think much of Hubert Humphrey. When I went up there, the very first live United States senator that I met, that I didn't, not from Georgia, walking down the hall of the Russell building there with Senator Talmadge, coming from the other direction was Hubert Horatio Humphrey. And he never walked anywhere. He usually kind of ran and had a gait. Well, he came up and the two of them stopped to talk to each other, and I kind of backed away a little bit, being the new staff person standing around. And they talked for a minute, and Senator Talmadge said, "Come over here, I want you to meet somebody." And I went over there and met him, and Senator Humphrey turned and said, "Now what can I do to help you? I know you're new up here and all this. My wife knows a lot about real estate. Where are you looking, on the hill?" This is all in one machine gun burst of language. And he said, just let me know, and I'll be happy to do what we can. I know Muriel will be happy to take your wife around and show. I thought, Jesus. So we go on down the hall a little way, and Talmadge has this sort of little grin on his face and says, "Wasn't what you expected, was it?" So I guess it was probably, we were in session that year up until Christmas Eve, just a day before Christmas. And the door burst open in my little office there, which, those big 12-foot tall doors in the Russell building don't move easy. But he popped that door open and came running. It was about 7:30, 7:45 at night. And wasn't anybody in there, and I was trying to do what I was supposed to have done at 8 o'clock that morning. And I start to get up and do it, and he says, sit down, sit down. I just want to tell you, you haven't called me, and Muriel's just all anxious to help. And I know that it's getting right on Christmas, and so right after the holidays, when we get back, I want you to just set something up so she can take your wife around and look. I said, well, Senator, we found it. No, he was gone, all maybe 45 seconds to a minute, Yeah. But he was that kind of guy. And in the years that he died of cancer during the latter part of my time up there, but he never forgot anything. He always remembered people. He was unfailingly kind to people. He and Talmadge differed on politics as polar differences. He served on the Ag Committee Talmadge chaired. They talked about things, mutual things in agriculture that were important to the country and the South and the Midwest and all other things of that nature. But they never agreed on politics. But
that reminds me of Senator Javits and some debates between Talmadge and Javits. Were you around when all that happened?
Some of it, some of it. Senator Javits was not Hubert Humphrey. I would say that Hubert Humphrey, in his own way and in his own style, was a believer in what he talked about and felt with, and he had integrity of his beliefs. They weren't alike at all. Senator Javits was somewhat different in his approach to law and the Senate.
How was Senator Talmadge to work for?
On one, at one level, he was probably the most interesting person to work for because you had to keep your head on all the time to try to keep up with him. You never got ahead of him. but you tried to keep up with him. He was a detail-absorbing person. Myself, 2 or 3 of the legislative assistants that we'd have in there would go over a piece of legislation, say in Finance Committee, and that's almost a foreign language to me. But we would go over, say, for a whole weekend. We'd be in there working on something and think we really had the thing down. We understand this thing now. So Monday morning at about 6:30, Senator Talmadge would have his copy in front of him, and we'd say, "Yes, sir. What can you do?" And within maybe 3 to 5 minutes, he would have asked a question that none of us knew. Not only didn't know the answer to, we didn't know that there was a question. He would get into things like that so quickly, and hit his finger right on the nub of the problem. That was a great learning experience. He was an exacting person to work for, but he was a very loyal person to work for. And I think the thing that I admired most in that relationship was he trusted you. If he disagreed with you, and you had made a fool out of yourself before you knew that he was going to disagree with you, he never did it in public. You know, he may have had some discussions after, but he never never embarrassed anybody, and never did anything like that.
He was known for his early hours. Did you have to get up before the rooster crowed?
Well, Senator Talmadge would get up and run, and he got up about 3:30, but he also went to bed with the chickens. He'd get up and he ran, I don't know how far it was, but he had a circular path out near where his condo was. And he ran in combat boots, jump boots. We tried for years we bought him Nikes, things that you should do. We had people come and tell him that he should not run in those boots, you know, those kind of things. But he liked them, and he ran in fatigues and Army jump boots. He would come in to the office usually between 6 and 6:30, depending on whether there was somebody else going to be there. An interesting piece about his early hours, though, is, you know, his mother lived to be 100 years old, and they had a very interesting relationship, and a friendly relationship, but as you would have with a 100-year-old mother. She had a phenomenal memory, and when Bobby drowned and the funeral was out there, she stood at the back door greeting people, and they were lined up all the way back up. I think the State Patrol said there was about 5,000 to 6,000 people that came through there that afternoon. She spoke to every one of them. Somebody would say, a younger couple or something would say their names, and she'd say, "You kin to so-and-so?" "As my grandfather," or "as my grandmother," you know, something like that. "Well, they're a good family." And she had a phenomenal memory of things of that nature. But one morning, I parked on one end of the building, and Senator Talmadge parked in the courtyard. Early in the morning in the Russell building, as you might recall, you can hear people walking on that marble. So I heard this chomp, chomp, chomp as I was coming down to turn the corner. And that meant that he was already in the corridor down there that our office was on. So I round the corner, which is, our office was about halfway down it, and he had rounded it at the other end. The phone starts ringing. Well, either a wrong number or it was our office, because nobody else opened their offices up at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I hear this phone ringing, and Senator Talmadge starts dog trotting down through there, coattails flapping and briefcase, and unlocks the door and throws it open, grabs the phone on the receptionist's desk as I round the door to get in there, and says, "No, Mama, been here a while."
You mentioned Bobby's death. His son Bobby drowned, I think, in Lake Lanier. That had a tremendous impact on his life, didn't it?
Almost killed him. He felt very strongly that his political career and life in general, he had never paid enough attention to his family. I think one of the things that came out of that death was that there were some tremendous letters and things from people that you might not expect to get them from. There was a 6 or 7 page handwritten note from Ted Kennedy that was as heartfelt as anything you've ever read. He had about a 4 or 5 page letter, handwritten note, also heartfelt, from Richard Nixon, who was in California by that time. But across political lines, across everything, but everything, the letters were very personal. And when Senator Nunn came over, I guess it was the first few days when Senator Talmadge was back in Washington after the funeral, Senator Nunn came in, and said, he says, "Sam, I want you to do one thing. Don't ever neglect your family." He says, "None of this is important." Mm-hmm. And it brought tears to Senator Nunn's eyes and mine too. So, I think it just about did him in. He and Betty were not on good terms, hadn't been for 20 years, and I think that was the final straw, probably, in that.
Senator Talmadge made quite a name for himself during the Watergate hearings. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that. Were you there then?
I was here. I was here. I wasn't in Washington at that time with it. I was back and forth. Some campaign, that kind of stuff was going on prior to that. He took his duties seriously, although he did not want to be on the committee in the first place. And Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader at the time, had convinced him he needed to be on there because they wanted somebody that actually understood the law. And there were 2 or 3 good senators on there that really did not want the results that happened to happen. They didn't want that kind of a thing to be, and they didn't want it to be a circus. Mm-hmm. And there were an equal number of senators on there that wanted it to be a circus, mm-hmm. of both parties. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that probably Senator Talmadge and Senator Baker from Tennessee, a couple of others in a way, were trying to do something that some of the others weren't. Mm-hmm. And that was to do and establish the legal steps into it. We had some good lawyers on there. Fred Thompson was minority counsel, mm-hmm. later became a senator from Tennessee. Mm-hmm. Jim Hamilton was was on the Democratic side, and who was later Senator Talmadge's attorney. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting time.
Did he ever express his personal opinion about the break-in?
The break-in, no, I don't think he ever really thought a whole lot about that, because the overwhelming problem of Watergate became the cover-up, not the action. The action was stupid. Why would anybody bug a campaign office? Who's ever said anything in a campaign office that was worth bugging in anybody's party? So I think that aside from the general consensus that this was dumb, mm-hmm. In the beginning nobody thought that it was going to bring down a presidency, and just from the historical and traditional situation, you don't want to do that, no matter what you think politically of the president that happens to be there at the time. Mm-hmm. So I think that as that started, it was going to be pretty much thought of, but also known to nearly everybody was that all presidents have tapes. Mm-hmm. All presidents tape everything that goes on in the thing. It goes back to Roosevelt and wire recordings and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. Some of the most interesting things I've heard were Lyndon Johnson's tapes that are now in the library. But they knew that there was some record, but nobody was talking about it. You know, it was not one of those things that say, well, check the record. Well, I think the consensus was that those things were private tapes or at least executive privilege for people being able to converse with their staff and whoever was in there. I know Senator Talmadge always treated any conversation with a sitting president as almost sacrosanct. He, or with anybody, if it was something that was told in confidence, dynamite wouldn't get it out of him. So it was always that way. But when fielding in an offhand comment to some of the committee attorneys, not in front of cameras or anything else, but in an interview room, said, "Well, I'm not sure what that was, but you can check the tapes." Then it was on record. And from that point forward, it became the thing about Watergate was the cover-up.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Senator Talmadge would have voted for impeachment?
I think he was terribly disappointed in Richard Nixon. They were not friends, but they had been together. You know, Nixon hung out over there a good bit during the Eisenhower years when he was vice president. And Nixon was fairly close to a lot of the senators of both parties. He was not a warm, fuzzy type person. But I think that there was a general respect for him in the Senate that of people of that generation. And I think Senator Talmadge was just very disappointed that the judgment factors. Mm-hmm. And usually when people in politics do something that they're your friends and they do something embarrassing to themselves, you feel sorry for them. Mm-hmm. Even though you know they're wrong. Mm-hmm. And I can think of one or two that you and I both know that fit that.
You know, Senator Talmadge was, I guess you could say, silent force behind some of the most progressive legislation passed while he was up there in the Senate. Rural development, a lot of helpful programs. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, most of that went on just prior to and on his becoming chairman of the Agriculture Committee. Senator Russell had a great history of rural help and rural development. Senator Talmadge followed in that tradition, and that's the good part about a good thing for Georgia, a good thing for the country, is that we generally kept our senators around long, a good while. Senator George, Senator Russell, Senator Talmadge, Senator Nunn, all of them there 24 years or more. You get a chance to do something good for the state and for the country. I think the rural development thing was something that he felt very close to. When he was governor of Georgia, he was very much an instigator of making sure that school buses picked up black and white kids. That although segregation was the law of the state and the land, the separate but equal was taken fairly seriously by him. He passed that first sales tax, which largely went to building some roads so that people could get in off of those slick red mud places. So there's the history of rural development, and it's hard to put in today's terminology when everybody has electricity, everybody's got television sets, even in a 2x4 shack someplace. But in those days, they didn't have that. And they not only didn't have roads, they didn't have electricity, so the REA was a very important thing to get behind and do and try to bring power out into the small areas and small communities. He took that seriously. He took it seriously to move us up from somewhere in the 40s to second, I think, in timber production, chicken production, things of that nature that created jobs in rural areas and trying to make some things happen. I don't know today what you would do, how you would go about doing some of the things, or to justify some of the things that that were very good. They look more more socialistic. That's too strong a word, but they look that way nowadays when you start talking about government doing this, that, and the other. But there wasn't anybody else to do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that the tradition that Senator Talmadge represented of carried right on through with now modern days. Mm-hmm. There's still, we've been fortunate in our selection of senators over the years, and I can't think of but one or two that probably shouldn't have been there, you know.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned segregation as a political issue during that period. I think it's pretty well established that Senator Talmadge maintained a very close relationship with the black leaders in Georgia.
Absolutely. They were an integral part of what he considered Georgia politics. Daddy King was a genuine friend of his, and several others that were in there. I found it interesting to watch some of our northern friends and his colleagues from up there, and not understanding the relationship in the South. I think that while Senator Talmadge moved into the modern times with his thinking and times of what was going on, as governor, he stoutly defended the law of the time, mm-hmm. as did governors following him and before him. But the politics of race never interested him. He really detested people that would use, quote, a race card, primarily because it meant that they didn't have anything to talk about, that they had no substance to them to be able to do it, to fall back. And I may be some warped along that same way, but I feel the same way. People that I see pull a card to use that way, whether it's quotas or whatever it is, I find that to be somewhat distasteful. So, in my opinion, the people who do it usually drops a few more notches. Mm-hmm. Means they don't know a better way to make an argument.
I believe it was in 1979 when Senator Talmadge had a problem with the Senate Ethics Committee. Tell us about that.
Well, I was in the middle of that one. The paint a larger picture, it was also a time after Bobby's death. Senator Talmadge had never been known as a teetotaler throughout most of his life, starting in the University of Georgia, or maybe before that, or all the way through. But it had been a contained problem, and it was also during a period of time that nobody thought of alcoholism as being a disease. It was just, oh, so-and-so's had too much to drink. Well, Senator Talmadge could never hold his liquor. And I've had former roommates of his from Athens tell me this, and friends that have known him a lot longer than I had. But my observation was that he could not be a normal social drinker and have one or two. But if he had more than two, it usually went straight through him. And at 3 drinks, he was where a normal person would be at 8 or 9. So it's a sad thing. I mean, and what's even sadder is that nobody recognized those things in those days. Nowadays, you know, you get 14 people to run up and do a cause and get 2 psychiatrists to talk to you or something of that nature. But it, in '79, he and his wife of 25 years or so, Betty, were getting a very bitter divorce. And this was right on the heels of the death of the son, which Betty openly accused him of, even on the night of the Senator Talmadge had been in Georgia when Bobby drowned. He had been down to see his mother and was coming back from there when they got him. He went up, identified the body, etc. But Betty had been disappeared for 7 or 8 weeks at the time. And she did that on periodic things. She would just disappear. If she left the country, we had a friend over in the State Department that would let us know her passport had been used, and that was about the only way that you knew that. But that night when we came in, there was a little play back and forth of getting them together and been out to Bobby's house and all this. Anyway, Senator Talmadge was waiting on her down at the farm when we pulled in, and he got up out of his chair to come across to her. I mean, up to that point, we had found her, brought her back on a plane that night, and she had been the grieving mother, as you would expect. But when she walked in there and did that, he got up to walk across the room to her, and she says, "Well, I hope you're satisfied you've killed him." And it was just like somebody taking a baseball bat, you know, and whacked him right in the kneecaps with it. But he blamed himself for that neglect of family that he felt he had done. Probably not any more than any other political family that I can think of, but he blamed himself for not being around at all times. Of course, Bobby was a grown man, 30 years old, had children, etc. But 79 started out that way. That was the theme song around this. We found, and it's something I caution every human to do when they take over a job like being chief of staff in any political office, have an audit. And what we found was that there had been a duplicate account set up. I had been the chair of the Georgians for Talmadge campaign committee in Georgia in 1974. It was, I've forgotten what the total amount of money we spent was, but it was somewhere around $48,000 for the thing. And we did a 42 cents on the dollar return on any money that had been collected out of that campaign committee, Georgians for Talmadge. That was the only campaign committee that we had, we thought. The fellow that had been Senator Talmadge's administrative assistant up there had set up another account at the Riggs Bank in Washington, and it was called Talmadge for Georgia. Very close play on the same words, but it was not the campaign. But he would make solicitation calls to various people around the state who would answer the solicitation call as campaigns do, and he was depositing it in the Riggs Bank. And we started a little, I was a little suspicious when we did the return on the checks. It just didn't seem like to me that, I mean, it was in the papers and it had been stated, but I would run into people sometimes that say, "Oh yeah, I haven't gotten a check." Now, most people didn't cash the things. I still go into a few old banks and businesses around that have them framed up on the wall, saying, "Never got one of these back before." But finally had to just close the account. Well, when we did that, we were suspicious that somewhere along the lines, either somebody had thought they gave us money and didn't do it, or somebody gave somebody some money and it didn't go there. So that was a suspicion, but it wasn't what caused the problem. We decided to check. They changed the rules. They always change the rules around. And so during a rule change there, we were trying to figure out how we were going to budget the Georgia offices and that nature. And I discovered that there was an account that I had never seen before, and so I went to the lady, the bookkeeper person, and I said, "What's this?" And she says, "Well, it's your account." I said, "An account? I've never seen it before." I said, "Well, it's set up by the chief of staff, and it's his account." I said, "When was the last thing done in that account?" And she goes back and checks it. Well, just before you came. I said, ain't my account. That's when we got the audit. And we found that there was money being siphoned out of the Senate, official Senate accounts, and that's what triggered everything. Then we found the political accounts, and that triggered more. But all of them pointed back to this same person. And so the part of the Senate money in there, which Talmadge turned into the Secretary of the Senate and for inquiry, became the Ethics Committee inquiry. Mm-hmm. So it was a move instigated by Senator Talmadge himself to find out where all this went. We were beginning to have our suspicions. But Jim Hamilton, that fellow that I was talking about a little earlier with the Watergate thing, volunteered his time and efforts as Senator Talmadge's attorney. Well, one night, this thing went on for over a year, but one night we found out, we got a phone call from somebody saying there was an account at Riggs Bank, because they kept saying that you had this account at Riggs. No, we ain't got a bank at Riggs. Only thing's Trust Company of Georgia, and here it is. Well, we went down there, and it was almost something out of a movie. We got down to Riggs about 6 o'clock. The place was, of course, closed up. It's right across from the Treasury Department. Dark, little lights on in there. We're met by a vice president who'd come back in from somewhere in Maryland. He took us across the bank floor, which was all closed, dark. Little elevator, come upstairs, table, and they had these checks up there that had Riggs National Bank, Talmadge for Georgia, head paper there, and it had a letter that was signed with the signing machine, Herman E. Talmadge. And if you recall, it was sort of a long signature that he had in there when it was done by that. And they had all the canceled checks, those little narrow perforated federal type checks. Well, they weren't wide enough to do Herman E. Talmadge from the signing machine. You know, if you were signing it or something, you'd just make it smaller. But the particular person that was embezzling all this money was left-handed. I could do a very good Herman Talmadge, and several people in the office could do a pretty good Herman Talmadge. Mine was so good the Treasury people couldn't tell which one was which on it, but it wasn't mine. And it was a signing machine, and he'd angled the check like this so that the thing would get across it and sign it. So I took one look at it, I said, that's the signing machine. I said, this letter's signed by the signing machine. It's typed on a typewriter, and they've misspelled campaign. So, all of which, this fellow was not a great speller. He was left-handed, and we finally found out where the typewriter came from. But we had people in there checking every IBM Selectric in the Senate to find these things. We found out it was actually his. He'd purchased it in Brunswick from an IBM typewriter office there. That later a friend of ours had told me the story about how he'd sold it to him. Anyway, I'm sure that typewriter disappeared somewhere. The Ethics Committee hearing drug on for over a year. In the process of that, Senator Talmadge's alcoholism was recognized by him, by others. He was at Bethesda. Senator McCain's father, Admiral McCain, was also an alcoholic. And he and Senator Long and others formed an intervention. Normally done, that was a family type thing. But in the sense of Talmadge's family, it was as much those people and staff as anybody else. And so literally that night when that was done, he was in the air on his way to Long Beach. Dr. Persh, who was the Navy captain and in charge of that hospital, is the fellow that started the Betty Ford Clinic. He, very interesting guy, and he and Talmadge talked to each other a lot, even way after Talmadge was out of office. But that caused, I mean, he was never hitting on all 8 cylinders, all 79 and most of 80, or nearly all of 80. I mean, he's really, it was a shell of the old Herman Talmadge.
So that led into the 1980.
Well, one thing on the 79 thing, the Senate Ethics Committee never found any wrongdoing. They found bad judgment, mostly because of hiring the fellow that was there that did most of it. The money that was found there was in Riggs Bank. This same fellow had set up a program where he was defrauding a former roommate of his named Nimitz, no kin to the Admiral, who was with the State Department. They had a house together that they rented, except that this person had sold the house and was still sending Nimitz a check at the end of each year, or an explanation as to why there was no check. And the fellow he'd been somewhere else with the State Department, come back, he's married, lived in Washington. This fellow and his wife were still dining with them, seeing them and all that. He was carrying on the same fraud. He also defrauded John Amos at Aflac by selling him interest in a bull that he said, the Y Island bull. Y Island is part of the University of Maryland. They have prize animals and this type of thing. And so he had sold the idea to John Amos that they had a sperm bank for this particular bull, and that was what they were selling, to the tune of a couple $100,000 he got John Amos. Well, John found out about it and sued him in a Virginia court, got judgment, and threatened all sorts of other things. Federal charges overwhelmed it because of stealing from the Senate. They frown on that. And but he was convicted of all of the things that the Atlanta papers accused Talmadge of almost daily for 2 years. And served time, 4 years in federal pen.
Well, that brings us to 1980. His re-election campaign. You were the chairman.
No, actually, I wasn't. Charles Campbell was. Charles Campbell was the chair, and Russell King was the treasurer. I was an interested bystander.
Well, we always believe you were the strategist.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not. We had a group there that tried to steer the campaign.
You had at least 3 worthy opponents.
Absolutely.
Zell Miller.
Maybe more than that.
3 that were, well, I guess you could say considered the front runners in that.
We considered that the lieutenant governor was the front runner in the campaign, and there was a congressman and a former Supreme Court or appeals court judge, and somebody else. Forgotten who.
I think those were the major.
Those are the ones that I knew their names.
Right. And it resulted in a runoff between Senator Talmadge and Lieutenant Governor Miller. Rather bitter runoff.
Was. I think both men were, and if they were, one of them still is very strong-willed, and they were. I'll probably get hit by any survivors on this, but I think they were a lot alike. I think they had a lot of the same kinds of views of Georgia and of things. I think that they probably came along in different eras to be able to express some of those. I respected the idea that the lieutenant governor wanted to run for the Senate. I just didn't want him to run then for the Senate. We had I think bitter would be a good way to talk about it, because the two men themselves were very strong-willed. As I said a little earlier, I don't think Senator Talmadge was hitting on all cylinders at that time. I think he was in the middle of that recovery that he later did pretty well out of, but he was really a changed person after that, and after that coming out of the alcoholism. Mm-hmm. But it was an interesting campaign from the standpoint you had two guys that knew a lot about Georgia and a lot about politics, and they went at each other pretty strong. Television in those days was a bit of an experiment, at least it was. And Senator Talmadge was never comfortable in front of a camera. He could sit and talk and do things with you one-on-one, and fine, you turn that camera on, he froze. So he was never comfortable with that, and I'm not sure that the ads ever really did well. In some of the debates, though, they did get at each other, and I'm not sure that Governor Miller was that comfortable with cameras in those days either. Mm-hmm. And so you had two guys that you could tell if they turned the damn cameras off, they really get at it, you know. But we did have a few moments of some fun.
Well, Senator Talmadge, of course, finished first in the primary of voting. What do you think turned that around for him? He didn't win without a runoff, which most people think is a sign of weakness.
I think it was.
And so, you know, people were confused about Talmadge's ability to pick up those votes to win the election, and Miller's ability to hold on to what he had and gain. But there was a point there when momentum swung heavily to Talmadge. Mm-hmm. What caused that?
I think there's a couple of things. I think the assumption that he was certainly weakened in the Democratic primary. He had not run a contested Democratic primary in 20 years. I think that there was that degree in there of people being torn, because the lieutenant governor had been there and around the state and was well known and liked by most of the same people that liked Talmadge. Now there were some on the outliers of both groups that were probably more bitter than anybody else were, but generally speaking, I think that inside the party the core was really torn, because they had two people there that had been very good to them and loyal. I think that, and it showed in the general election, two things were happening. One was that people had become somewhat embarrassed over Talmadge's very public admissions of alcoholism. You look back on 30 years ago, that was a no-no. People just didn't do it. Speaker Murphy was a supporter of his and would, at the same time, standing there next to him, denounce alcohol. But anyway, it was, I think that slapping on the wrist was some of it. But I think in the long run, people started feeling a little bit sorry for him in the Democratic primary. And I think Zell's attack was a little harsh. And I'm not saying from where I was sitting, but from looking at it now, that it was probably a little too harsh to do that. I think the same thing may have happened in a more recent governor's race here. But I think that's part of it. And I think that the confusion of having a couple of other qualified people running who were knocked out in the first go-round, but qualified, and they had their supporters. Mm-hmm. And they didn't all flock to either side. They split up everywhere, and some of them just went home. Mm-hmm. So I think the runoff, at least in my mind, was never that much in doubt. I figured we could win, although traditionally you would think if you don't come in first in the one and they're close like that, that you're not going to get those other votes. I never felt that way as we went into it. I've been in races where we've lost in runoffs, and I pretty well knew it going in. But I think some of it was that they just didn't want to see the old man get knocked. But I've also talked to good friends of mine and Senator Talmadge and everything else who voted against him because they thought he'd been there long enough. So then along comes the general election, and somebody noticed that an awful lot of folks that didn't get born here, didn't know anything about what Herman Talmadge had done for Georgia, were voting. They didn't vote in those first elections.
That's true, yeah.
But you know, certain counties come in late. They always do. Now, in that particular instance, they came in the other way.
Yeah. There was some concern at the time about Senator Talmadge's returning to Washington and sort of not campaigning. Do you think that had an effect?
I think it does in retrospect. If anybody close to that ever tells you that they urged him to come back to campaign, they're lying to you, because to a man, we all thought he should go back to Washington and let the wounds heal, because the bloodletting between he and Governor Miller was severe, and it had rent the party in twain. The conventional wisdom was that this was enough bloodletting, and nobody knew who the typewriter salesman was. And so we underestimated that, and there was some extremely negative campaigning that went on in the media after that. Probably about the first week of October, several of us had that itch that you get in the back of your neck when you don't feel that things are going right, and started talking about it. There was no money left in the campaign. It was just, we'd stopped raising money. We didn't need any more money, and I think there was something like $35,000, $40,000 left to close the lights down. And we didn't raise any money during the general election. So the sayers, the doers, and all that cognoscenti came back in there with the idea that Senator Talmadge needed to go on television and knock this thing in the head, because they were doing overcoats and everything else that was in there, which is a whole other story. But I guess I called some people, and they were all, what we decided we needed was about $100,000. Shows you how much things have changed. We needed about $100,000 to do television. And we didn't have any trouble lining up 10 people that would sign a note and do $100,000. Of course, with the idea that once the thing's over with, it won't be hard to get that repaid and done. So put it all together, had it all ready to go, took it to Senator Talmadge and says, "No, not going to borrow money to run a political campaign, most ridiculous thing ever heard of. Can't raise the money, we can't raise the money. If we can't raise the money, and that's what it's going to take, we're going to lose. Not going to borrow money." He was sort of opposed to borrowing money. He didn't like that idea for federal governments or state governments or anybody else's, or him, to do that. So we didn't, and lost the election by about 25,000 votes.
So he lost his seat, and Rogers Wade had to make a decision. What did you decide?
I needed a job. Fortunately, I had left the staff the year before, and I was in business, more or less, doing things, representing some clients, and mostly federal things for Washington. We were in the middle of rewriting laws for the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, something that I'd had some knowledge of as we were going, and so I was doing that. That's when I think when we lost the election, you've been around losing elections, you know how everybody feels down. You don't really feel like you want to do anything ever again that had anything to do with that. But I was offered a job with a company here that did business in about 40 states, and I took it and was there for 5 years.
Came back to Georgia.
Came back to Georgia. I didn't want to stay in Washington.
And eventually you wound up with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation.
Can we take a little break?
Sure. Rogers, before we get into that, let's talk about the overcoat.
Well, that was one of those things that in that 1980 general election a lot was made of. There was an ad, overcoats, money. The background of it was that when the case was going in Senator Talmadge's favor, Ethics Committee, 3 grand juries, none of whom found any wrongdoing, never written in the paper in Georgia. But Betty, his wife, who was divorced at this time, was very bitter, and she saw that this thing was the thing had shifted, and she was going to run for Congress about that time. That was what, 78, 79, somewhere along there, and she didn't want to see him exonerated on this business. So she volunteered on literally the last day or two of the Ethics Committee hearing. They were ready to close down and be through. The person involved, named Daniel Minshew, had been proven to be, he'd committed perjury and had several other things in there, plus theft from the Senate. And that had all been proven. And all of those facts were laying out there for it. So she showed up at her request, and she'd called the committee council, marched in. This, of course, made a lot of headlines, a lot of camera coverages. And she produced $7,700, 7,000 of which was wrapped up, still had Treasury seals around it. And she said that she had gotten that money out of Senator Talmadge's overcoat in the hall closet. And she had the date, and I cannot remember the dates on it right now, but she named a date that she had gotten this. And so that caused a big stir, and before you could examine it and look at it, every paper in the country had money in overcoats, those pictures and all this stuff, and the cartoons. It's funny, made lots of good stories. I usually get pissed off when people do it, still. But the money that she produced, the $7,000 worth of it, were wrapped in Houston Federal Reserve straps. They had been printed 2 years after she would have not had access to his overcoats or his apartment or anything else. They had all been printed and shipped to the Houston Federal Reserve, and the Houston Federal Reserve had shipped them to Lady Bird Johnson's bank in South Texas. They had the trail, follow the trail. Ms. Talmadge had run for Congress and had evidently received a cash contribution from Ms. Johnson, who was a good close friend of hers, and Liz Carpenter, who was Lady Bird's press secretary, and Betty were extremely close friends. Anyway, the $700 that were loose in there were old bills, silver certificates, as a matter of fact, which have not been in wide circulation over the years, even in the 70s. So this raised some suspicion, especially the 2-year lapse after, the money was printed 2 years after she said she'd gotten it. A rare lapse on Betty's part of looking after detail. That changed the whole complexion of it. It was not a factual change, but it changed the way people looked at this. Here's an old politician with money stuffed in his pocket. That opened up a whole new series of questions from the committee. there were probably 40 or 50 Georgians that were hauled before them up there to testify that, yeah, that's the way we did things before 1972. And it was the way things were. The cash was done. I can remember, I think it might have been Garland Bird telling the story of going on a campaign with Governor Herman Talmadge and coming back to a hotel room after that campaign in South Georgia and just peeling off sweaty, wet clothes and pulling money out of wet pockets. I have been places where people came up and wanted to give you cash in a campaign. And after the rules changed, some people took it very personally when you wouldn't take their money. Very personally. I can remember somebody that I had not taken something from getting in touch with the senator to tell him they had to get rid of this whippersnapper that won't take. I'm trying to give him some money for you, Herman. Well, I can't do that. It's got get rid of that kid. Yeah. But anyway, the story, while it has its merits to being funny and a political long story, was never true. But the factual parts of it were never in the paper. A lot of cartoons, but never the facts.
Okay, now let's get back to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. What exactly is the Georgia Public Policy Foundation?
Well, it started in 1990-91. I was here, partner in Eddington Wade at the time, and we were doing business in Washington and Atlanta. And I was asked to join a board of a 501c3 that was being formed, and it was going to have sort of a diverse thing. I explained to the person calling that I had no money to put into foundations, etc. Said, well, we just want you in there to balance it up some. So it was basically a group of business people who thought that the factual parts of what was needed to be said weren't being said, and that they believed in a free market solution to the way things happen. So I went on the board and started going to the board meetings, and they had lunches, and thought that it was an interesting thing. I discovered that I did know most of the people that were on the board, and the only instruction that was ever given from Hank McCamish, who was their starting chair, a successful business fellow here in Atlanta in the insurance business, was always tell the truth. Said if you always tell the truth and keep your facts straight, doesn't matter where the chips fall. And so that was the guiding light. Well, I had in about 1995, 96, I had a series of heart attacks, and it just about convinced me that I didn't need to be getting on Delta 3 times a week and going places around the world. So that wasn't hard to convince me of at that stage. So I was really kind of thinking of being retired and doing that kind of thing. And we were looking for a new president for the foundation. And I was on that little group of people looking for a new president. And we had some really interesting people. And I had talked to most of them along with others. For one reason or another, we'd always find some reason why we didn't think that would be exactly the right person. Some really well qualified folks. And we had a 3-star general who was just retiring. He's from Georgia originally, but he hadn't been here in about 30 some odd years, and he was leaving the War College or something up there. And I went back, and we had our little lunch to go over having dinner with him the night before. And I pointed out that it would take him a long time to find Ludowici, and you know, being facetious, but it was I think a fact. If you're not around Georgia, it's hard to understand that we don't just have 2 Georgias, we've got a whole bunch of Georgias out there. And so they quite rightly said, if you're going to complain about every damn one of these people, you do it. And I gave all the protestations that you can do it, and then agreed to do it for a year while we found somebody. Well, it lasted about 14 more. So I think that we've made a difference in things. So the fact that people running for high office, both sides have used the same sets of facts. They draw different conclusions with them, but most of our tax stuff was being used by both sides in nearly every race since we first started publishing them. And I think that's probably the best thing. You know, as long as it's true, the facts are there, you can draw different conclusions with the same set of facts and get different directions to go with them. But as long as you got that basis, it works. Well, that reputation grew. As you well know, this was a solidly Democratic state in the early 90s, mid-90s, and through the end of the 90s. But the state hasn't changed any. R's and D's have changed. But I contend that Georgia is a sort of center-right conservative state, always has been, hopefully always will be. It was good for Georgia. It was good. The solid approaches that we have to government have always been solid and conservative. We never spent money. I don't mean conservative in the social sense, I mean in the fiscal sense. And I don't think that's changed. A lot of people gave Governor Miller all sorts of flack for, quote, changing. I don't think Zell really changed. I think Zell's always been a good, solid thinker and a fairly conservative person. I know that maybe at times when we were on opposite sides of elections we might have pointed out his more liberal tendencies, but I think bottom line there really is not much of a change in where people are. And the one thing that we decided not to do with the foundation from the get-go was we would never get involved in social issues. Nothing about abortions, nothing about any of the things that are social issues. We'd stick to the fiscal, to the governmental, to public policy.
So your organization basically researches issues like taxes,
education, taxes, transportation, water, all those things. We get involved, or I'm the chairman of the board there now, which actually does nothing but chair a board. Kelly McCutcheon runs it. He does an excellent job at it. But it's basically a fact-finding and here's a policy you might want to try. Well, over the years, they've learned, people at the General Assembly have learned that they can trust the facts, so they don't mind quoting the facts and using the facts. We will testify on our material and our facts, but we never lobbied. And we don't do any of the things to push an idea, or if someone introduces a bill that's based on our facts, we will talk to the facts, not to the bill. So over those years, I think it's become something to be relied on. I hope that it can stay in that direction and be that quality. We, as a matter of fact, gave Governor Miller the Outstanding Service Award from the foundation in his last year as governor, which I was very pleased that he would take and that we got to do.
So you recommend changes in policy?
Absolutely. And a lot of them have changed since we've been there.
Yeah. Well, what are some that you have changed?
Well, we've been a big advocate of charter schools. There were none when we started. For a long time there were 3 or 4, and we have urged changes in those policies with the General Assembly and with others around the state. We have even started a charter school called Tech High. It's about a mile from the Capitol. right in the middle of Atlanta. We chose that because it was a neighborhood that had a lot of poverty, a lot of kids that with single parents and no parents and things of that nature. It's a math and science oriented charter school under the Atlanta public school system, and the charter schools are public schools. We have when we started, we had kids that were 3 and 4 years under grade in their reading, writing, and everything about them. And the first year, we probably were getting a lot of the troublesome children because we did it as a citywide thing, so the whole APS system was available. But as the word spread that this was a serious school, not someplace to send the dummies, you know, this is serious. If you want to learn, this is it. We took them to Georgia Tech on campus for about a boot campish type thing for 6 weeks in the summer before they started in the class, which is basically an evaluation for us to look at them, or them to look, the school people to look at them. And it was also the first time that some of those kids had ever even thought about being on a college campus. They were very helpful, and as we started, we thought we would be able to locate over there nearer to the Tech campus, and they had promised us everything from wet labs to students to help with things, which they have done over the years, just not adjacent anymore. Some of those kids out of that first class, and we've now had 7 classes, maybe the 7th, yeah. We've had kids with full ride scholarships to Notre Dame, Emory, MIT, Tech, all sorts of things. Up until that time, there were very few people out of APS schools going to Georgia Tech, let alone any of the rest of these. Our grades are higher than the average for APS. I think within 1 or 2 marks of the highest in the state on some of them. So it proves that any child can learn if you'll do things. What started this was the foundation gave out awards to no excuses schools. And those were schools that were performing above a norm. You know, they were outliers of up and down. And that's done with a sense of the poverty structures and what happens with it, and they're all over the state. So one time in there, we decided that we've been recognizing these things just as printing things up and saying you're exceptional school. Got Bell South folks to do some little plaques. Got Governor Barnes to come out there all day and do grip and grins with teachers as we awarded them these plaques. And it gave them a great sense of some accomplishment and recognition. But then after that, before we started Tech High, you start trying to figure out, well, what makes these schools different? Well, 99 times out of 100, it's the principal and then some of the teachers. In some rare occasions, you find a superintendent where the whole system is going up by a bootstrap. But most of the time, it was principals. And so we figured if you can do that with some of these schools and some of the counties where things are really tough to do with no budgets, then we can probably, if we can do this in the middle of downtown Atlanta with that situation, then it can be done anywhere. So we did another one out in near Reynolds, around Oconee, with a little bit different thing, because then we didn't have to fight for utilities, we didn't have to raise $5 million to do it, and we had a contentious situation to form politically a charter school in a place where there were 2 high schools. And we had the land donated by the Reynolds people. And so immediately the argument was, well, they're just doing this for their people out there, so countywide. And they've discovered it actually has enhanced the other schools that they had there. It's a good challenger. In theory, so is Tech High to the Atlanta school system, but the Atlanta school system is geared not to like charter schools, and they have done everything humanly possible while smiling and looking at you straight to thwart those. The Tech High is in a 1922 grammar school that was abandoned for 10 years. It was on their surplus market until we said, okay, we'll buy it. No, we decided we're going to keep it. What we want you to do, if you're going to be in there with it, you pay us rent, you fix the heat and the water, and grammar schools have water fountains down here instead of up here. Mm-hmm. And bathrooms in grammar schools are down there and not up here. So it cost a lot of money. We got a lot of that donated and helped with people through the foundation. Mm-hmm. But what we wanted to do was make a difference, and I think in that instance and in the instances of bringing the water questions up, really talking about the interbasin transfers, we all grew up when that was sacrosanct. It may not be the same as it once was. We've tried to make a difference, and that's what the foundation does.
Mm-hmm. I think you'll agree that that government is more and more about money and less about efficiency and economy. Has your organization looked into that?
Oh yeah. We've looked at a lot of different things. To start out with taxes, and there were 159 different tax books. And computers have changed a lot of things because you can put things in there. The information's there. So several years ago, we did a report and immediately had a demand from some of the people in state government for copies of the report. What do you mean? Mm-hmm. City governments didn't know, you didn't really have communications with county governments, and county governments didn't take into consideration what city governments were doing, and none of them took into consideration what the state was doing. So you had a lot of, not misinformation, but just no communication. So computers have helped that, and we started this thing of transparency a few years ago, and lo and behold, people started grasping on to it. And it's gotten to be sort of a buzzword now, but it's still a factual thing. You need to have it. Again, using the Atlanta school system as an example, the law stated at that time that charter schools would be treated no less than public schools, but you didn't know what less was because they didn't have the printed thing. You didn't know how much money went into a classroom. Information was there, just not transparent. Mm-hmm. And you had to dig and dig and dig and find it. We had people in state government who said, well, that'll, take a couple of trucks to haul that over there, until we said, okay, we'll file a Freedom of Information Act and have it. Somehow, by the time we got back to the office out there, they discovered that it was on DVDs. So,
Yeah.
And we got a couple of DVDs, had all that, and saved a truck. But those things, sometimes with a little push to them, and sometimes with some subtle support from elected officials that I certainly don't consider lobbying.
Yeah. Well, we're broke. Have you made any suggestions about that?
I've been more familiar with the brokenness over the last few weeks and months than other times. I don't think that it is a total situation to say that the state is wasteful. I think there's a lot of other things. I think that nearly every governor I can remember has moved to one degree or another to make government more efficient. I think that in each one of them's mind, that was what they wanted to do, that's where they were trying to go with it, and sometimes you just couldn't push Stone Mountain, and that was about what it was like. I think right now, and the last several governors, all of them have cut and eliminated and done, but government is not like anybody's business that you can actually say, I want you to cut your department and do such and such. There's a lot of people out here. 100,000 of them work for the state. There's some really good people working for the state, some really, really good people working for the state, and they work hard and they do a good job, and they're not always well compensated, but they're dedicated to doing public service. And that, sounds kind of cliche-ish, but it's not. And there are a lot of people that, if they had gone into some other line of business, would have made a heck of a lot more money. But they really like what they do, and they're doing a good job at it. Then we found a few people that probably shouldn't have been there. And sometimes they're there because of a political favor. Sometimes they're there because they've kind of wormed their way through the mess and risen to that position. But you should know, to quote Rahm Emanuel, which I'm not in the habit of doing, one should never let a crisis go to waste. And we are in the middle of a crisis in the fact that the economy is in the tough shape that it's in. We've got, the government has been cut a lot in the last 10, 12 years. It's been cut good and bad and otherwise. I think it's very difficult to say that you're going to cut something slash across the top of the board, because that punishes the people that are doing a good job. And there are a lot of people doing a good job that have already tightened their belts and moved in and been doing something. So if you cut them 10 more %, you put them out of business, or take away the effectiveness of it. So I think it's time to go with a scalpel into these things and not a machete. And I believe that that's what's happening now. I think that there's a good opportunity for a lot of those good people to put their ideas together and do things. I've always worried about the silos of state government. In research universities, we have some very good ones. Tech, Georgia, Medical College, several other schools. They all have good research in different areas. They don't overlap each other very much. But there's very little that communicates between them. Tech's got their people over here doing something. It's important. They do a lot more research. Particularly, I know when I was in Washington, and probably you saw the same thing. Tech was at one time one of the largest recipients of DOD money in there. It's not true today, but it has been through the past. Georgia's got some great things happening over there in biosciences, and this little flap that just recently came through about between the schools through the Board of Regents about the engineering school. Georgia's always had an engineering school. It's been called ag engineering. And part of the deal was when they let a certain trade school on North Avenue go forward, they would do engineering and they wouldn't do business things, and Georgia would do those and do that. It's been eroded somewhat over time. I saw a big billboard on the way here today. It says MBAs at Georgia Tech. That seems like it's a long way from engineering, but I'm probably confused. But anyway, Georgia we need more engineers, and we need a different kind of engineers. Those people can go build a rocket to go to the moon with, but we need people that can build the building to build the rocket in. And I had a fellow that was a retired president of Southern Company Nuclear. He said, we probably hire 60, 70 engineers a year. He said 2 of them might be nuclear related. The rest of them have to build pipes and lay foundations and do sites and do this. It's engineering. The other side of that is that engineering nowadays is not always done with bricks and mortar. And the important thing to breaking these silos down is to recognize the fact that you need a math kind of person to come do something with a biochemist to do something. And so you build a different kind of engineering school, not one that has engineering written up on it, but a mixture of those faculties. And nobody has that kind of a mixture other than a large land-grant college. We got one of them over there. So I think breaking down those institutional silos to where they can talk is very important, and will mean more jobs to Georgians and bring more money into the state.
What do you do when people insist on maintaining their services but refuse to pay taxes or don't want to pay more taxes?
You mean people receiving benefits from the states or counties or cities or something?
Yeah, we don't want to lose our driver's license station, but we don't want to pay more taxes to keep it.
I'd say they were short-sighted, but Thomas Jefferson observed, and probably others before him, I think Cicero might have been the originator, once you let people into the trough, it's awful hard to get them out of it. I think that technology is going to save us from a lot of these things. We now know how to do things with technology that we didn't know before, or that we didn't know how to do before. You mentioned driver's license. It used to take 3 or 4 hours to go get a driver's license. And I haven't renewed mine lately, but I understand it's down to about 10, 15 minutes. They may be arguing with us about age driving here before long, and that may be something that we should worry about, really. But I think the average thing has come down on that. I think that, and that's technology, it's there. I believe that the technology is leaping forward on a lot of different things, and that we as a nation have stopped building things, stopped manufacturing things, and I don't think that's a good idea, but I'm just old-fashioned enough to believe the old thing of the 2 F's and the 2 M's. You know, if it's not farming and fishing or mining and manufacturing, it's not building anything. Those were the tenets of building this state.
What do you think about the proposed fair tax?
I'm not sure I understand what the fair tax is. If by fair tax that means that everybody pays something a flat rate, then I think it could be worked on some. I think whatever we do, that we've got to change the way we do it. Our tax structure is indecipherable. I don't know anyone, human, who can or will read all of it and understand it. When Congress passes 2,300-page health care bills with nobody having read them, and if the rule of thumb is still about the way I remember it from Washington, there's about 10 pages of regulation for every 1 page of a proposed law. So that will really make it unreadable.
You mentioned the R's and the D's. What do you think about the TPs?
I think that they show up under one name or another in about every 10 to 15 years. I think, what was his name? He's still running for president every once in a while. Started out with Corvairs.
Oh, Nader.
Nader, Ralph Nader. That was the other end of the spectrum, but it was the...
Incidentally, I had a Corvair, and I thought it was a great car.
I did too, and it was a good car. It was my very first car after we got married, and it worked fine. If it had a heater in it, I'd have really been even happier. But it was, it's a very good car. I like that car. But I think that those phenomena of politics come and go. You had Nader, you had the guy from Texas,
Ross Perot.
You had all of those.
George Wallace.
George Wallace may have been a little bit different angle on it, but same kind of outliers. Mm-hmm. I think every generation seems to produce another one. The interesting thing will be is there still going to be a quote Tea Party next time, or will they split off? I think if in fact they do stay and become a separate force, it will only be to the detriment of the regular Republicans. I think I used to make a speech about the American eagle is a great bird, and but it's being beaten to death by its wingtips. And I had a couple of people in mind, neither of whom are in politics in Georgia anymore. But I had two people in mind that were beating the thing to death, you know, like this. And I think most of us are somewhere in here. Mm-hmm. I don't know any party or any politician that I 100% agree with. Mm-hmm. My wife and I have been married 48 years, and we don't totally agree with each other, but I know when to shut up. So it's just kind of one of those things that you do. I don't know. I think in the short term those things are detrimental, and maybe in the very short term they probably do cause people to think and do things. I don't know where the Tea Party eventually ends up.
Let's talk about Georgia for a minute. The Republican Party, of course, now controls state government, taking it away from a Democratic Party that had held power for 100+ years. What happened?
I think for many years we had factions of the Democratic Party that would settle in most places for being two parties. I grew up being a Russell-Democrat, Talmadge-Democrat. That was a title that people bore with pride. That was where you were. That's where you thought. People knew what you meant when you said it. They had fights between, in the Talmadge case, the Talmadgeites and the anti-Talmadgeites. And that was the two parties. I don't know that they were ideologically very far apart in there. It was more personalities than things of that nature. And I'm not positive that there's any real change in the way most Georgians look at people and politics now. I think there's a twinge on the right and there's a twinge on the left, and those people are always most vocal. But I think the National Democratic Party abandoned the Southern Democratic Party. I don't think that they have we ran out of people that were hyphenated Democrats, and the National Democrats became the picture of it. And there were more people in Georgia that could not identify with that than people who could identify with it. So they became ours, because the candidates that were ours started representing what they thought they were. Mm-hmm. We've all got friends whose grandparents were staunch Democrats and their grandchildren are staunch Republicans. Mm-hmm. But is there really any difference?
I heard somebody say the other day that today's Republican Party in Georgia is what the Democratic Party used to be.
I think if you take away all the media haunt around that, and take away race cards and things of that nature to whatever the time represented, and put it back to a basic philosophy of governance, I think that's not far from being right.
I've heard some angry Democrats say that their party has become too urban, too liberal, too dependent on minorities, and too dependent on organized labor. Are they right?
Yeah. I think they might be. A fellow that we've talked about several times seems to have that opinion, and I have a great deal of respect for his political acumen.
Well, he was drummed out of the Democratic Party in Washington. You're referring to Zell Miller. What do you think of Miller's performance in the Senate?
I think he was a good senator. I think he went up there with I mean, he knew who he was and what he was, and there weren't any changes of that nature. But I think he got up there and discovered something, and he discovered that those people are terribly big hypocrites. And I think Zell, particularly the older he gets, is less tolerant of hypocrisy. I think that he saw, and as a matter of fact, I think he communicated this to Senator Talmadge before he died, that he did understand some of the things that he had to put up with in Washington that didn't translate back down to Georgia for common knowledge. I think that Zell did a very good job of understanding those people, and since he knew that he was not going to build a career in the Senate, that this was at the end of a political era, that he had no reason in the world not to share his views, and I think he did it very well.
Well, Rogers, it's been a pleasure having you. Any final thoughts?
How do two old folks like us get around talking about things like this?
Well, it's been fun.
It is fun.
Of course, we could probably sit here and talk all day.
At least.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to say that you know, we need people like you, and we need organizations like yours to help us, as they say nowadays, reinvent ourselves.
I'm not sure that the reinvention is going to be much different than the original invention, but it is interesting, and I, just as an aside, feel very, very comfortable with the direction that our new governor is taking. He's a fine man, a fine individual, and I think that will translate over into how he governs. And that it's a root thing of every governor that I've ever known.
Right.
Depends on that personality.